It is really hot today. In fact, I just checked the weather app just a couple of seconds ago, and it's actually 98 degrees outside right now, which means it's 108 degrees in my room right now because my room tends to be always 10 degrees hotter than the temperature that is outside. If you're wondering, well, why don't I turn on a fan and why is there isn't any sound of a fan? Well, that's because I bought a brand new fan after my old one unfortunately broke, and the new one seems to be very, very loud, and that if I turn it on, it will be so loud that you couldn't really hear my voice. So basically what I'm gonna have to do, unfortunately, is I'm going to have to suck it up in terms of sitting in this room in 110 degrees heat while doing this video, and kind of do something similar to what those players did during the tournament down in Orlando City. Although, to be fair, at least I don't have to worry about humidity as most of those players had to deal with throughout the tournament. And we all know that dealing with heat is one thing that is something that is hard to do, but dealing with heat and humidity, that's a double whammy in terms of the pain that you have to deal with in terms of heat. And I argue dealing with humidity is much worse than actually dealing with heat with no humidity whatsoever, because when you're dealing with humidity, that's when you're going to have a really tough time to breathe. And that I really want to salute all those players that play in that tournament and how in the world they were able to get through that tournament without just look like absolute zombies with the humidity and the heat that they had to deal with when they were down in Orlando to play this MLSisback tournament. But that being said, speaking of this MLSisback tournament, since the tournament is over, this is a time where I, of course, will start making these post-tournament series of video where I talk about the standout team and also the most disappointing and also the most surprising team throughout this tournament, as well as my 10 favorite moment throughout this tournament. And we start off with this series by talking about the 5 teams that stand out in the MLSisback tournament. And as always, this is just a list that I'm putting in. It's not a ranking system, which means number 1 isn't really the team that stands out the most throughout this tournament. And as always, and I'll probably say this again at the end of the video, if you agree with my list, let me know in the comments below. If you disagree with my list and think there's one of your team should be below on the list, also let me know in the comments below. With that being said, let us begin with the first team that I'm going to put here on this list, which is none other than the champion of the MLSisback tournament, which is the Portland Timbers. The short explanation of this is that anytime when you're a champion of a tournament or in an MLS season, you're going to be the most standout team throughout the season because you were the best team and you won the trophy that the other 26, or in this case, the other 24 teams are trying to get. And I think the long explanation has to be is the fact that I was kind of surprised, but also at the same time impressed of how the Portland Timbers played throughout this tournament. Like, judging by what they did in the first 2 games, and if you even go back to the latter stage of last season, it seemed like teams had figured out their system. And that it seemed like teams have realized all they had to do is just bunker in and ask if the Timbers can, of course, break them down. And the answer to that, at least for what we saw in the first 2 games of the season and the latter stage of last season, is they can't break down a team that bunkers against them. Well, throughout this tournament, there were a couple of teams that tried to do that, and it doesn't seem like it actually worked because it seemed like the Timbers, at least at most part, has started to figure out that Achilles heel that has been killing this team for the past couple of games. And at times, they also, so when we get to the knockout stage, they decide to go back to their bread and butter, which is just trying to bunker and trying to take advantage of every mistake that their opposition make and punish them. And they did exactly that. And really, that probably is one of the biggest reasons why they end up winning this tournament. And it seemed like this system that the Timbers are running and this system that Savarese tends to have seems to be very successful whenever it gets to a knockout stage. And that I really think in the future, when the Timbers does make the playoffs again, this could be a team that you should definitely watch out for, and that it could be a team that you definitely do not want to face when the playoffs is going to potentially happen in the latter part of this year. Now, at number 2, I am going to go with the runner-up, which is Orlando City. And Orlando City, obviously, you know, if you talk to any Orlando City fan, they would say that this was the first time they make it to the playoffs in their franchise history, and what a run it has been in terms of making the playoffs for the first time in franchise history, getting all the way to the final. Just unfortunately fell short at the final step, but take nothing away of what Orlando City has done throughout this tournament, and that Oscar Pereira, you know, as much as I've talked many times before of the fact that how he has transformed this team to be a bottom feeder team to a team that looked like could compete for MLS Cup, you know, I have to give him credit again with the way that he has just done that. And that now, if Orlando City can play like this during the regular season and they can continue to kind of have these good performances that they have throughout this tournament, no doubt that this team not only might make the playoffs for the very first time, but they could actually be a team that maybe can go for the top 4 spot in the Eastern Conference. And I know that sounds a little bit ahead of myself, and there's no guarantee that some of these teams, in terms of their performance that they've done in the MLSisback tournament, is going to translate into the regular season. But at least from what I've been seeing with Orlando City, this is really the first time that they actually have an identity, and that this is the first time that it's clear that it's shown to me for the past couple of games that this seems like a different Orlando City team. Like, this doesn't seem like an Orlando City team that, you know, this is just going to be a fluke run and eventually they are just going to derail and start losing games in a row. Something tells me that again, whatever Oscar Pereira has done to this team has completely got rid of all the bad luck that this team has had throughout their first 5 years in MLS. And I really believe when the season does resume, this is going to be a very dangerous team heading in the Eastern Conference. But that being said, at number 3, I am going to go with the Philadelphia Union. And I promise you guys that this list is not just the 4 teams that make it into the semifinal. There are other teams that I, of course, are going to put here on the list that didn't really go deep into the tournament, but I really think they kind of stand out in some way. Now, the Union did make it to the semifinal, and again, I know a lot of people still haven't get what I always want to point out with the Union, but I feel like a lot of people need to give credit to Jim Curtin and what he has done to this team, and also the youngster on this team, of the fact that they are able to mature their way to get this far into the tournament. I mean, that is quite an incredible step that the Union has, and that a lot of people was questioning, you know, after such a great season the Union has last season, can they move a step forward, and that can they continue this good run that they have, probably the best time in their franchise history. And after this tournament, the answer is yes, because of the way that they, of course, got into the semifinal. Now, as I said before, we'll see what happened in the regular season and whether or not if they can continue to be a good team and could be a team that could be a threat heading into the Eastern Conference. My answer is probably yes, because I know there's a lot of Union player in their team that have a lot to prove in terms of not just playing for the team, but also there's a lot of European scout that is watching this team, and that I'm pretty sure that there's a couple guys on this team with the likes of Brendan Aronson and McKenzie is going to want to play very well for the rest of the season, so that they could potentially earn a move to Europe, and that the Union is going to get a big sum of cash once they decide to sell him either in the end of this season or in the future couple of years that is going to come. Now, at number 4, now this one is a little bit controversial, because I know people are going to say that LAFC, this tournament, they choked again. Like, they choked when it really matters, and the fact that how in the world are they stand out if they, of course, did pretty much the same thing they did last season and the prior year, which is they just tend to crumble whenever there is this big game that they, of course, could make it to the next round. Now, in some way, yes, that of course is the case, but you got to also keep in mind they lost in a penalty kick shootout against Orlando City, and that I feel like in a penalty kick shootout, it is really harsh for one of these teams that, of course, fortunately got out, because penalty kick shootout is basically a coin toss up until that point. And yes, I understand they did give up that late goal to Orlando City and really become the only team in this tournament knockout round to score first in this knockout round, but unable to move on into the next one. But I really feel like with what I saw with LAFC throughout this tournament, and that you got to keep in mind, this is an LAFC team without Carlos Vela, and there was obviously a lot of question. Well, can this LAFC team look like a Supporters Shield LAFC team without Carlos Vela? And the answer is yes. They can. It's been proven throughout this tournament that they are once again going to be a very lethal team. And once Carlos Vela gets back into this team, yeah, this is going to be an LAFC team like we have seen in the past. Now, my only concern with LAFC has to do with the defensive side, and that they definitely need some defensive reinforcement. But I have just heard news that they have just made a trade with the Vancouver Whitecaps in terms of getting that top allocation spot in MLS, and something tells me the reason why they make that move is because they're going to get that defender from that top allocation order, and that is, if they are able to do that, then yeah, this team is kind of inevitably going to potentially not only make a deep run in the playoffs, but are going to be favorites again in MLS Cup, and is going to get over the hump that has really labeled this team as kind of a team that tends to choke when it really matters in the knockout round. But moving on into number 5, and this team actually didn't make it past even to the quarterfinal. This team actually got knocked down first hurdle, and you're thinking, why do I still put the Columbus Crew as a standout team if they knock out in the first hurdle? Well, that's because the Crew, of course, also lost in a penalty kick shootout against Minnesota, and that, again, in a penalty kick shootout, it's basically a coin flip when that happens, and unfortunately, the Crew came out on the wrong end of that coin flip. And that you got to also keep in mind, the Crew throughout this tournament, as much as they started very well for this tournament, in the latter part, injuries eventually kind of caught up to their team, and that not having one of their best defender, Vito Wormgor, who's going to be out for the rest of the season, and also Eloy Room, which we don't know exactly if he's going to be back with this team for when the regular season, of course, resumed. That, of course, did kind of hurt them. And then, obviously, they then lost Jonas Mukhtar right on the last game of the group stage. So, injuries really plague this team. But once they do get those players back off of injury, and if they can continue to show what they've done throughout the group stage of this MLSisback tournament, I mean, I label them as a dark horse team heading into the Eastern Conference and heading into this tournament. And it seemed like after 3 games that they play in the knockout stage, doesn't seem like they're labeled as a dark horse, but more like a team that could really compete and could really be a team that can, of course, make it far into the tournament. Now, again, obviously that didn't happen because they unfortunately lost in a penalty kick shootout. But again, there is a lot of potential when you see this Columbus Crew team, and not only the fact that there's a lot of potential. This team, as we're about to restart the regular season, is at the top of the Eastern Conference, and he didn't get to the top of the Eastern Conference by any mistake whatsoever. So I really think if they can, of course, continue to play like they did in the group stage, then I think this team is going to be another team that I don't even want to call them a dark horse anymore. I think this team can really be a threatening team heading into the regular season with the way that they have been playing throughout this season and also in the early part of this tournament. But that being said, let me know in the comments below, what do you think of this list? And again, I think I said this before earlier, but I'm going to repeat myself again. If you disagree of some of the teams I put here on the list, let me know in the comments below. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I, of course, will see you guys next time.